Really good.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Is that all right? Cool.
Yeah,
We're
that's
away.
perfect.
So I've done the introductions. So really what I was just trying to say is we all know there's going to be a massive, there is competition for land in a whole range of ways, whether that's biofuels, food, housing, recreation, energy, public goods. There's going to be increasing demand for land. And we all know that our farms, are having to deal with climate change, whether it's been dry or wet or hot or cold. We're definitely seeing extremes. So we need to think about how we can adapt our farming systems better to help deal with some of those issues around climate change. And starting off with soil, when I did my master's in soil science 27 years ago, it was deeply unfashionable, and now soils are very much, front and foremost, both in terms of farmers thinking and also in terms of government and policy thinking. And we need to make sure that we're aware of some of those issues. And on the theme of soils, I sort of just put a bit of data up, which is typical organic matter or carbon levels in UK soils. And from the dark panel you can see there, it's fairly obvious that there's a lot more organic matter in grass, permanent grass, than there is in mixed systems or arable systems, and inherently there's more on clay soils than there is in sand soils. But what's quite interesting is that that data's from 1985, and that's the last time we had a national inventory of soil organic matter in the UK. So we're sort of steering blind with 30 to 40-year-old data, which is not really a great place to be. The graph in the bottom right is quite interesting in itself, looking over a sort of 15-year period, and the purple bars at the back and the blue bars at the front both show a decrease in soil organic carbon, and it's as notable in grassland, and that's permanent improved grassland imbi, as it is with arable fields. And the scientists can quite easily explain the reduction in soil carbon on arable fields where there's tillage, but they're a bit more at pains to try and explain why there should also be a decline in permanent grassland soils. And we can maybe have a conversation about that later on, but to my view, it's quite easily explainable. So the background to all of this is that actually, agriculture has been pretty good over the last 70 years at increasing productivity, but it's also been pretty good at emptying the soil carbon account. We've taken more out than we've been putting back in, and that's certainly more so in intensive and arable systems than it is perhaps in all grassland systems, but the trend is the same in both. And underpinning all that really is this whole concept of a sort of soil food web. At the top of the pyramid there, you've got grassland or shrubs or crops or whatever, and they're photosynthesizing and they're capturing solar energy, and about 60% of that solar energy is used to grow the grass or grow the crop, and about 40% is released through the rooting system to feed the biological cycles in the soil beneath our feet. So the organic matter, the carbon, is consumed by the fungi and the bacteria, then by the protozoas and the springtails and the nematodes, and then by the larger earthworms and mites, etc. So there's a whole living ecosystem beneath our feet, and that's fueled largely through that sort of carbon photosynthetic pathway. So actually having a living plant is really, really important. And if we take just one of those organisms, something like an earthworm, which we're all familiar with, in a earthworm cast, there's 5 times as much nitrogen, 3 to 7 times as much phosphate, 11 times as much potash, 3 times as much magnesium. Darwin called these the ecosystem engineers, and he was dead right. You know, that they're multiplying the nutrients and actually making fertility. So a farm without earthworms is really devoid of the ability to process carbon, organic matter into nutrients. And the three most common species you'll see of earthworms are these epigeic, endogetic, and anesics. The anesics are the deep burrowers that do the drainage. They're the ones you'll see the blackbirds sort of leaning back and pulling out. They've got a flat end on them, which they anchor themselves into their burrows, and they do the deep burrowing. The endogetic are sort of in the middle, doing that sort of mixing of soils, and the epigeic are right at the soil surface, bringing in those sort of residues. But they're all really important, and those are the three main ones you'll see in UK agricultural soils of the sort of 13 species in the UK, or 21 in mainland Europe. So, you know, our job as farmers is really simple. We harvest sunlight and we turn that into carbon, into grass that animals eat, or crops that we harvest. If the sun goes out, it's game over for all of us. So that's really our job, is to maximize photosynthetic capture. And, you know, in my situation where I'm looking at crops, what got me interested is that, you know, in terms of normal sunlight hours through the year, the point of where there's near maximum solar radiation, I was sort of turning the sun off in mid-July, August and September. I wasn't building carbon. I was just allowing crops to senesce in the field. And maybe that's the same after a silage cut as well, or a hay cut. There's very little growing green leaf there to actually take photosynthetic activity and turn it into more and more carbon. So whether we're a forester or a farmer or even a solar PV engineer, photovoltaic engineer, we're all in the same business, harvesting sunlight and turning it into carbon, which fuels and drives our systems. So that got me thinking a little bit a few years back, about 15 years ago, about trees and how nature sort of does this job in terms of solar capture. And we sort of all recognize, you know, from reports of the Amazon and, you know, watching David Attenborough on TV, that, you know, trees are important for climate change and the lungs of the planet in terms of cycling carbon dioxide. Could they have a role in agriculture? And you know, was the mixing of agriculture and trees something that was worth considering? And that's what I started exploring about 15 years ago. But one of the big challenges here, of course, is that agroforestry is not forestry and it's not agriculture. And one of the big challenges is that the skill sets in both are quite different. So I did a quick sort of scan of the local area where you guys are, and Peter had sent me this sort of map of the locale. I sort of zoomed in a bit just to looking at what was there, and I happen to know Low Luckens farm, so that's an area I know down in the south corner there. And there's a sort of aerial picture of it, and you can sort of see that actually it's a fairly mixed landscape anyhow. It's not devoid of trees. Yes, there's some plantation forestry, but actually as you get closer, you realise there are quite a lot of trees, certainly a lot of hedges in the landscape. And what's really interesting is if you zoom in a bit further, so this is this corner down here, I think, just here on this farm. Apologise if it's one of your farms, anybody that's on the call, but there's some sheep in here, I would think, and you can see they're in the middle of the field, but actually there's quite a few sheep tucked up under the hedge bottoms, either getting some shelter or maybe doing a bit of feeding. So it's quite interesting to use these aerial photographs to find out, and drones, to find out what your animals are doing. So agroforestry is not a new concept. You know, this is a picture from Western France back in the late 19th century, and it shows a very different landscape than we see today. And post-war, there was a real division of forestry and agriculture, and any land that had more than 50 trees per hectare on it ceased to be agricultural. It became forestry. And that existed under the Common Agricultural Policy until 2012. And there's a story there in that myself, a Greek gentleman and an Irishman, I'm sure there's a joke in there somewhere, stood up in the Parliament in Brussels and lobbied for change, and we got change to move that 50 trees per hectare to 100 trees per hectare, and now at a national level it's different again, which we can talk about later on. So as I said already, there's a lot of confusion between farming and forestry, different goals and objectives, different language, different measurement metrics used. I jokingly say that most farmers have a good infection of arborphobia, and most foresters have a good infection of agriphobia. We tend to sort of separate ourselves, at various levels, but maybe there's a mutual thing that comes together which can benefit both. So agroforestry really is when there's a mixed land use combining crops or livestock on the same area, and where there's a significant ecological or economic interaction. Those can be negative, but they can also be positive, and we're always trying to seek a positive interaction. Typically, that's either silvopastoral or silvoarable. I'm involved in silvoarable on my own farm, but actually the silvopastoral is probably way more relevant to you guys. So that's trees and pasture grazed at the same time. And ultimately, from an ecological perspective, agriculture is a false man-made environment. You go from sort of exposed natural rock under a sort of volcanic or landslip situation. If you left that alone, eventually it would go through annual plants, pioneer plants, through to shrubs, woody perennials, and then eventually to high succession forest. That's what land wants to do if you just leave it alone. Agroforestry is sort of slightly more to the right. Tillage and crop production is way more to the left, and grass is sort of somewhere in the middle. So it's about blending those sort of things together. But for sure, thinking about the kind of things that Darwin said, is that in nature, plants do not grow in a monoculture. So a monocultural improved grass is just as much a monoculture as a field of wheat. It's using the same roots in the same zones. It's using the same canopy to harness photosynthetic activity at the same time in the same place. So it's got some risks, and it's maybe not as efficient as it could be. What got me quite interested in the idea of agroforestry is this principle of actually using the resources in terms of water and light and nutrients and space at different times of the season. So the graph we've got here shows that in this case it's a cereal production, but the crop uptake of nutrients and water is quite early in the season, and then when they get to maturity it drops off. Whereas the trees start much later in the season and carry on right through to the autumn. So in my own context, I planted cereals this time last year. They photosynthesized right through till about July, and then they're dead, ready for harvest. The trees that I've got in my system didn't actually put on any leaf until April or May, but they've still got leaf on now. So they're still photosynthesizing. So we've got a temporal separation of when those resources are used. If we add to that actually, as farmers, if we're lucky, we maybe think 2 or 3 feet above the ground. We might think at the height of a cow's back or a sheep's back, or the height of an ear of corn. If we're really lucky, we start thinking below ground. But actually, we're quite sort of two-dimensional. And the other bit that got me quite interested was the concept of using more space above and below ground. My landlord charges me rent on a per acre basis. Thankfully, not on a per cubic acre basis, because all the land that's up there, all the space that's up there, and all the space that's down there beneath the feet is all free. and it's about trying to exploit and use that area better, both in terms of time and space. What brought that home to me was some work being done in southern France by INRA, the French National Research Institute. These are 18, 19-year-old poplar trees, and the tree on the left, or the root on the left, which they'd exhumed, is in a plantation situation, and the tree on the right is in an agroforestry situation, and they are literally about 20 feet apart, but completely different. Same species, same tree, same age, just a different level of management. And the forest or the plantation situation, all the nutrients and water are near the surface from the leaf litter. That's where the trees go looking for their food. In an agroforestry situation, the trees have to go looking deeper if they can, because there's an annual crop growing. Now, whether that's cereals or grass being grazed by animals, when those trees wake up later in the season, there's nothing for them to utilize in terms of water and nutrients. So they end up putting their roots deeper. If you marry that to make perhaps a bit of cultivation or some strategic root pruning, which I think is an absolutely essential part of agroforestry, you actually partition the roots in, or manage the roots, just as you manage a canopy, to go down deeper and use those resources in a different place and at a different time. There are some biodiversity benefits. So this is some work done by Reading University, looking at 6 farms in 2009-11. In the early years of agroforestry on my own farm, mine's the one in the pink ring, comparing a sort of monocultural situation and a agroforestry situation, looking at both levels of biodiversity and levels of pollinators. And some of these are grassland farms and some of them are cropping farms. But in most cases, the level of biodiversity and the level of pollinators is far greater in the agroforestry situation. And that concurs with work done by Jim McAdam in Northern Ireland, looking at ash agroforestry in grassland and ash woodland. And it's the same story, more biodiversity in the agroforestry than either in the woodland or in the grass, because the grasslands are monoculture and the woodlands are monoculture. And it's about having that polycultural system, and most of the biodiversity that we see is at the edge of things, at the interface between two different habitats, at the edge of a tree belt, the edge of a hedge, the edge of a field. And that rings quite well with, or correlates quite well with, some of the other work that's been going on more recently by Reading University looking at biodiversity, and they generally find more birds, plants, fungi and insects in agroforestry. And importantly, they tend to see more of the beneficial insects and less of the predatory, harmful insects, which is the kind of thing that we're trying to see in terms of beneficials. And just in the last couple of months, there's been a couple of really important papers published in scientific journals looking at, agroforestry systems and what they bring. And they found sort of headline figures like 200 more solitary bees and hoverflies, 200% more, 240% more bumblebees, 10 times higher species richness, etc., etc. So it's delivering on that sort of biodiversity, which is the kind of stuff the government are after as well. So one of the questions I'm often asked is, what about sort of, resource utilization and competition for those resources? My local farmer said to me, "What the hell are you doing planting trees on good productive land?" That's often something leveled. But ultimately, some of the things I'm trying to do is to improve soil and water quality and protection of soils, to reduce wind speeds, to increase a better local microclimate, and importantly, to reduce evaporation and water loss from crops or from grass, or increase drainage at the other end in a very wet period. So those modified microclimates, we forget that in the UK, we cling to the edge of Europe in so many ways, at the edge of the ocean in a very windy climate. And the wind is a major factor in terms of temperature and in terms of water loss and precipitation. So trees can help with that, both shelter, but also in terms of the water cycle. For those of you that are, obviously applying bag end to in-by pastures, again, some really interesting work done by the French, comparing agroforestry, agriculture and forestry. And as per the green bar there, very little amounts of nitrogen lost in the forestry because very little applied. Agriculture, what have we got there? 35 kilograms per hectare per year. Nitrogen use efficiency in the UK, 48% as we stand today. So 52% of the nitrogen applied to all farm crops and grass in the UK is not used by that grass or by the crops and is lost to drainage and watercourses, which is why Northwest Water, Yorkshire Water, etc., will have to spend a lot of money cleaning nitrates out of drinking water. Agroforestry is interesting because those deeper tree roots have the option of capturing some of that nitrate and turning it into carbon, and therefore keeping that investment on the farm rather than it being lost. Curiously, on the back of this bit of research, a little water company called Nestlé, who own a company called Vitel in Western France, switched their 100,000 hectares of land into agroforestry to manage that water supply and reduce nitrates in that bottled drinking water. So there's lots of examples of agroforestry around the UK. Do interrupt me and ask questions if you've got them, please. Otherwise, I'll just talk for England. But there's silver arable systems, which we'll talk about later. Cropping, using field-scale machinery. Obviously, crop rotations are longer, both in terms of the arable crop and the tree crop, which can take 10, 20, 30, 50 years. And that can be for both biomass, fruit, nuts, crops, grains, etc. There's a big place for agroforestry in terms of riparian management, both in the lowlands and the uplands, for protecting watercourses, helping with flood management, and putting buffers in place to limit both nitrates, pesticides, and pollutants getting into watercourses, and help with flood management. Really quite important in terms of trying to slow the flow of water down slopes and reduce flooding events. But it needs to be thought out very much the catchment scale, and government are certainly coming round to the idea of that sort of green engineering type solution, and we're having discussions already about agroforestry being very much part of the New Elms programme. A good example, I think, which correlates well with maybe your environment, is what happened in Mid Wales in Pont Bryn. These were a group of farmers, livestock farmers in the uplands, where actually, over a period of time, that those farming systems have become much more specialised and simplified. Hedges removed or managed in certain ways, trees removed, specialist livestock production, and they were having real problems with sort of compaction, overland flow, poor drainage, poor grass growth. Obviously, things like management of sheep and cattle, liver fluke, foot rot, biosecurity issues after foot and mouth, that kind of thing. So they engaged some quite intensive monitoring back in 2004, between 4 and 11, looking at different soils and infiltration rates and soil health. And as a result of that, they increased woodland or tree cover, by a relatively modest amount. But what they found is that the water infiltration in those shelter belts that they planted increased 60 times that of neighbouring grassland as a result of those roots. They tried to keep livestock out of the streams and allow vegetation to recover, allow those banks to stabilise, slowing the flows, etc. And they reduced. There was a good impact on flood cost insurance, and the Welsh government, were very supportive of the kind of work that they'd done. And this wasn't driven by government. It was very much driven by the farmers and their wish to try and improve and risk manage their businesses. So as a result of that, they found that they had increased farm net income, improved efficiency of livestock, and it was future-proofing and improving their overall operation, as well as providing some of those wider benefits in terms of flood risk, pollination, carbon storage, etc., etc. So that's quite well documented. If you want further information on this, some really good written up documents on Pontbryn on the Woodland Trust site, which you can sort of follow up later on. But it's not always about planting trees. Sometimes there's an awful lot of trees out there which aren't in a good place or a good shape. There's been a lot of farm woodlands planted under farm woodland grant schemes, which frankly are in a really poor condition, with very poor quality wood. And one of the things that we're lobbying for is to say, well, okay, how about starting with woodland and thinning it, getting rid of all the rubbish, and actually establishing a woodland grazing situation, provide shelter for those animals, allow them into the woodlands, which currently they're not allowed under farm woodland grant scheme agreements. And that comes really out of the back of some of the work that was done by what is now the James Hutton Institute at Glensock up in Scotland. The picture up in the top left, that's 28-year-old agroforestry planted at different densities, at different orientations, with different species. And what they found is that the animals would seek out that shelter. They'd roam out, that in good weather they'd be out on the fell, but in windy or wet conditions they would very much be in the covered areas under the trees, and that helped with their condition scoring, with their body weight, live weight gain, and their overall health and well-being. So there's a productivity gain by having access to some of those trees. For those of you in more favourable conditions, obviously poultry are certainly something worth considering with trees and agroforestry. After all, poultry are a woodland fowl, and it's only us as humans that take them out of that woodland environment and put them in a sort of open environment. And if you talk to someone like David Brass at the Lakes Free Range Egg Company, which wouldn't be a million miles from where you guys are, he's an absolute advocate of trees and poultry and agroforestry systems. He's seen much better productivity, much reduced health issues in his birds across a whole range of farms. So that's, if you're looking for additional enterprises, that's something worth engaging with. So whether it's parkland systems or whether it's sheep or cattle or even pigs, there are opportunities to think about how trees can be integrated, trees and shrubs and hedges can be integrated into agricultural systems. And to my mind, one of the most exciting areas is about feed and browse. And, I'd imagine you've all got livestock, and actually the one thing that you'll all be really good at is watching what your livestock do, watching their behaviour. And it's interesting to watch them in terms of what they browse, because they don't just eat grass. They spend a lot of time browsing hedges and trees, and we have to ask the question, why are they doing that? And what are they looking for? Well, typically they're looking for trace minerals. They're looking for different sources of protein. They're perhaps even looking for medicinal benefits and diet supplementation. If we look at different animals, so we look at cattle on the left, about 12%, out of choice, about 12% of their diet would come from non-grass species if they were given that choice. For horses, it's similar. For sheep, up to 20%. For goats, and if you keep goats, I do, it's anything that moves that isn't grass. And they're browsing the hedges and the shrubs all the time. And the reason they're doing that, if we look at some data here, so here's some leaf nutrition compared to red clover hay. And if you look at the tree species on the left, elms, rowans, willows, aspens, alders, birches, you can see actually there's some really quite reasonable fat contents, sugar contents, very high sugar contents, and quite high protein contents compared to straightforward grass and hay. So those animals are browsing those trees and shrubs and hedges because they're getting things that they're not getting from the grass pasture. So one way to think about agroforestry is, you know, watch what your animals are grazing, look for their preferences, which will change throughout the season because their dietary requirements change through the season, during lactation, during pregnancy, etc. And also the density of those minerals and sugars and proteins and fats will change through the growing season of the woody perennial as well. But in terms of palatability, you know, things like this is for sheep and cattle, aspen, willow, ash, rowan, hazel, oak, Scots pine, they're all quite palatable. When you get down to the beeches and the elders and the birches, they're a bit more bitter. But ultimately, you've got to try and match something that grows on your farm with the right sort of palatability and usability of the animals that you're rearing. If we look at some data of, in this case, cattle, heifers May, September born. In the spring, they can be browsing quite a lot more than perhaps in the early summer. And in the late summer, when the nutrition of those green species is probably less, but also the demand is less because they'll be looking for that nutrition of higher sugars and proteins when the grasses perhaps aren't growing quite so strongly. And you know, hazel, hawthorn, hornbeam are all things that animals will preferentially graze if they're available. The picture up on the top left is a guy called Tim Downs, who's an organic dairy farmer in Shropshire. And Tim and I have been friends for years. And there's a picture there from a few years ago of him actually planting some willow. And the whole preface here for his organic dairy herd was that we put some willow in because the salicylic acid in the willow is a natural aspirin. So the cows actually are now grazing these willows that have grown as a natural pain relief remedy. You know, the dairy cows are always under a fair bit of pressure with milk production. There's always a bit of discomfort with feet and what have you, and they actually go and self-medicate and graze some of the willow and take some of that salicylic acid as a pain relief. So it's a natural way of trying to combat some of the inherent problems. The pictures below here, the two at the bottom left, actually this is a farm down in Berkshire with a very mature agroforestry system. And while I was there a couple of years ago, we just locked off some lower branches of these ash and birch trees, and the sheep sort of just appeared from nowhere, from sort of 2 fields away, and made a beeline for them. And as you can see, they're thick on, straight into there, grazing whatever they can get hold of. Why are they doing that? Because they're getting something they're not getting from the grass. So watch your animals, watch what they're grazing, and see if you can supplement the diet. It's not only diet though, it's shelter. So whether that's in the heat of summer or whether it's in the depths of winter, nice picture up on the top left there, that even though there's frost on the ground, the frost under the tree isn't anywhere near as severe. Therefore, actually that ground is probably a bit warmer for the animals. Or whether it's shelter from the wind. The animals know it's about providing that shelter. Perhaps not Cumbria, but maybe a bit further south in Europe. But you can see just a couple of examples here of some sheep actively selecting a bit of shelter from the sun. And it doesn't even need to be a tree. They're actually doing it here on the right-hand picture from a wind turbine. So provision of shelter and shade is equally important for those animals too, in terms of their health and well-being and productivity. Some data here in terms from Lindsay Wistance, looking at lamb mortality and where sheep have got shelter, both single and multiple births versus no shelter. There's quite good scientific documentary evidence to show that that shelter is actually providing better mothering, better milk production from the ewe, and also better survival rates. So there's a case there to let them have, whether it's hedges or tree belts or coppices or whatever, let them have access to that. Are there any questions? Because I've been talking long enough. Any questions for anybody?
I'm just when establishing the trees, Steve, it was interesting because you're saying obviously you're going to look at the roots as well as the canopy. How many years? I mean, is it constant while the tree is there? You've got to like trim. You've got to trim the roots. How long? How many years would you have to do that? Or is it every?
Well, it's quite interesting that I've had a lot of comments over the years where people have said, "Yeah, but nothing grows under a tree." Which is a really valid comment, but quite often people are looking at trees that are perhaps like the one in the background here, that are very mature, that maybe 20, 30, 50 years old. But of course they've got massively established root systems. So I think whether it's a silvo-arable system or a silvo-pastoral system, a key element to agroforestry is to manage those roots. So I think it's really important to do root pruning just as you do canopy pruning. Probably every year or every other year or every third year, depending on the tree species and the growth rate. Certainly on my own farm, we probably, we canopy prune probably every other year and we root prune every year.
How deep do you go down? Do you, is it just a couple of feet or somewhere?
It's about 12 to 14 inches with a subsoiler. And we just use an agricultural subsoiler, and that's all we need.
Right, so you just run the subsoiler just along by the side of the trees.
Yeah, because those roots are really small.
Yeah.
With the year's growth, you break them easily.
Yeah, so there's going to be no impact.
Yeah. And if you wait 5 years, those roots have got big and they're going to be tough. Yeah. And the trees won't like it so much. So we're just giving them a haircut. That
makes sense. Yeah.
In terms of productivity, so the easiest way to explain productivity of agroforestry is what's called a land equivalent ratio. So we take 1 hectare of agroforestry, mixing trees and grass or trees and crop, and we compare it to growing trees and sort of agricultural activity separately. We actually find that you need more space if you grow them separately. Potentially there's up to a land equivalent ratio of 1.4, meaning 100 hectares of agroforestry can produce as much tree and crop products or grass products as 140 hectares of farmland. And you think, hang on a minute, that's 40% more productive. How can it be 40% more productive? Question one. And two, if it is 40% more productive, why isn't everybody doing it? Well, the how is quite simple, really. Go back to the beginning of where we started. We're making the farm bigger. We're using more space below ground and above ground, and we're increasing carbon building through photosynthetic activity by having those solar panels turned on for longer. The why everyone isn't doing it is largely been down to this separation of forestry and agriculture, and this sort of splitting of skills, and the common agricultural policy actually prohibiting largely the sort of mixing of these two disciplines. That's not me saying these things. There's a hark back here, Peter, but Cranfield University have been very involved in agroforestry, and they led a pan-European project over a 6-year period, looking at 42 tree combinations, and they found these land equivalent ratios ranged from sort of 1 to 1.4 at best, but the majority were around 1.2, 1.3. But that's still 20 to 30% more productive than a monocultural pasture system or a monocultural arable system. So there's merit in having the right combinations together. And one of the things I would steer you to, this is something that came out last year, which I was involved in putting together. It's actually the Agroforestry handbook. Yeah, so it's a nice little sort of John Nick's farm size book with lots and lots of information about agroforestry, very practical in terms of planning systems, about some of the economics involved, about how the actual systems work, both in terms of economics, etc., and some gross margins on sort of silvopastoral systems as well. So there are some hard copies around, but it's actually a free download off the Soil Association organic website as well, because they're one of the joint authors. There's a whole range of sort of authors on the back there that were involved, and you might find that quite useful as a free reference. And there's some forestry stuff in there about growth rates and management, etc. But one of the most exciting bits in there, I think, is a market that none of us have really got into yet, which is carbon. Because as we start thinking about some of the things that trees can do, is that they're very, very efficient at capturing carbon and embedding that carbon in soils. And more we're going to see both public money for public goods in terms of natural capital contracts to pay for carbon sequestration, but we're going to see private contracts. So the likes of BP and Shell and Waitrose and British Airways or Ryanair, depending on who you want to fly with, they're all going to need to find ways to offset carbon to meet the Paris targets. And as farmers, we can respond to that and offer ways to embed carbon into our farming systems, which actually help us with building soil and help us in terms of productivity and help us in terms of livestock production. So it's a real double bubble. And I think agroforestry is going to be a really useful element for that. In terms of climate change, just some data I put together with the Woodland Trust. You know, that Committee on Climate Change says that we have to increase tree canopy cover from 13 to 17% to meet our zero emissions targets by 2050. That would be 30,000 new hectares of woodland or 2 billion trees, 2,000 stems per hectare. That's a sort of Forestry Commission density. In 2018, the last sort of data that came out, there was only 13,000 hectares of woodland. 85% of that was in Scotland. England did a measly 1,400 hectares. But many farmers would say, I don't want my farm covered in trees. They don't want to be foresters. But what agroforestry does is it gives the ability to have agriculture and some of the benefits of trees on the same land area, whilst importantly retaining agricultural eligibility for all the schemes like stewardship, etc., that are going to come forward. And given that in England 72% of the land area is farmland, if we want to increase trees, it's not going to be through forestry. It's going to have to be through a mixed approach. And if we had a further 5.8% of farmland under tree cover, that would meet our increased targets in terms of net zero emissions agreed under the Paris Accord. So that's 5.8%. That's a fairly modest amount if all farmers did it. Obviously, if you're planting trees, you need to think about what you're going to do with those trees. They're not just for fun. Yes, they might have some benefits in terms of shelter or forage for medicinal benefits of livestock, but ultimately they've got to be another crop. So whatever species you're thinking about selecting, planting or managing, you know, is there a recreation or farming activity around that? Is there a sporting use? Is there a fruit and nut production? Is there a fuel production, or timber products, or even energy? There's lots of things that perhaps we don't tap into, that there may well be potential. Given what's happening at the moment, I think, you know, can we have Brexit back? It's a lot easier than COVID to deal with. But what has been the case under the Common Agricultural Policy for nearly 10 years is that there's been funding to plant and manage for 5 years maintenance agroforestry throughout Europe. It's just that our government chose not to select that option and make it available to English farmers, which is, you know, has been disappointing. But going forward, over the last 10 years, I've seen a big change, and in the last 2 years, a massive swing, with a lot of interest and commitment by government wanting to include agroforestry in the sort of new Elms programme. In fact, myself and the Woodland Trust and Organic Research Centre, and as partners, we've got a Elms test and trial on agroforestry, which will start next month for the next 2 years. So we'll be engaging with all kinds of farmers, including groups like yourselves, to try and find ways of understanding your needs and concerns about agroforestry, and also how we can get it into Elms in a form which provides the right kind of support and funding to allow farmers to adopt. So do come back on that and engage. Some of the other challenges around agroforestry is around tenure. You know, trees are a long-term project, and you know, 68% of the land is owned in England, but sorry, in the UK, but 32% is tenanted. And how do you plant trees on tenanted land? That's a challenge. Certainly one that I had to face. I'm a tenant myself, and I had to you know, have a discussion with my landlord about planting commercial trees, you know, within my farm business tenancies. But there are different shared ownership models which have been developed. One of the farms I work with down in Devon, they have a trust owning the farm. They have a tenant on the farm, and they've allowed the tenant to sublet the areas where the trees are to fruit producers, to timber producers and nut producers, and he farms around that in terms of silage and grazing his cows. So there are ways that can be done. So let's take a 2-minute break, and I'm sure that before I explain some of the stuff that I've done on our own farm, maybe there's a few questions.
I'm happy to ask a question, Stephen.
Yeah.
Ian Brown, I'm here tonight, I guess, with a Hadrian Bond hat on. So about private investment supplementing what might happen through Elms, particularly with agroforestry. So do you think agroforestry is particularly well placed to be funded through something like an environmental bond? I know both are fairly new to British agriculture. But can you see the two working together? I think for carbon sequestration, but for other natural capital as well.
I do. You know, as farmers, we're going to sit around and wait for Elms to come into place, which is at the very earliest going to be sort of 2025, and I think it'll be, you know, it'll take a bit of time for that to get going, for public money, for public goods. But I think alongside that, whether it's bonds or carbon offsetting, the concept of private natural capital contracts, you know, is ramping up really, really quickly. I think the challenge is for farmers is they don't know what they've got to offer the market. You know, if Mr. BP comes knocking on your door and says, "I'd like to offset a load of carbon in Cumbria," the first question he's going to ask is, "What have you got to offer me?" So to get ahead of the game as farmers, the place to start is to do a natural capital audit on your farm and a carbon audit. You know, you had Becky Wilson talking to you recently, and I'm sure she would have said something similar, but undertaking a sort of a carbon, energy, natural capital audit is a really good place to start. And then when those customers start knocking on the door, which they will, asking to offset natural capital or carbon or pay for bonds, you know what you've got to offer.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any more for any more?
Yeah, can I ask a practical question? And that's, you said that nothing grows under trees, but then you pointed to a big tree and said, well, that's 50 years old. Well, in 50 years' time, all your belts of trees will be 50 years old, so there'll be no room for anything to grow under them, will there?
Well, no, that was my point about root pruning and root management, is that those mature trees were just left to get on with things. So they put all their roots very near the surface, shown by that sort of forestry route earlier on. If you don't manage, the reason nothing grows under a mature tree is all those roots are near the surface. And in an agroforestry situation, what you want to do is manage those roots from day one, so that it allows those surface occupying species like grass to actually continue to have an area to thrive. And then when those trees do get to 30, 40 or 50 years old, you will find that the grass will still grow.
So yours are sort of almost like bonsai trees or something with the pruned roots. They will not grow to the same height and width as a natural tree.
What we find is that in an agroforestry context, the tree growth rates tend to be faster than a forestry context, because there isn't so much competition. You know, if you put 5 things all together in a line, they're all competing in the same space. You haven't got the sort of intra-competition from the same thing next door, and you've got more side light. So what we do see in agroforestry is faster growth rates and trees putting on girth and height quicker. So it tends to outperform the forestry models. But my belief is that we concentrate all our effort on what we can see in terms of canopy pruning. I think root pruning or root training is as important if we want to have this mixed system.
The other question I had was about roots. You will appreciate that it rains occasionally around here. We do, over generations, money's been invested in a lot of drains. What about all these roots and what they would do to the tile and plastic drains that we've got?
A super question. In fact, it was the very first question my landlord asked of me when I said I wanted to plant a load of trees, because we're under drained here with tile drains. And I scratched my head a bit, and I'd actually come across a really good piece of work from the University of Guelph in Canada. And the work that they did over there actually made a lot of sense, which is that, firstly, you know, you're not going to plant willow or something that's really invasive if you've got tile drains, because you're just asking for trouble. So selection of the right tree and the right species and the right size of tree is really important. The second thing is that it's about drain maintenance. If you maintain those drains and they're rodded or jetted and they're running clear all the time, in the summer there shouldn't be too much water coming out of them. It's generally, you know, autumn and winter when early spring when they're running, and that's when the trees are largely dormant. So when the drains are maintained and they're running, the trees aren't looking for water. However, if we're not maintaining drains and water is ponding in them in the summer, the trees will, when they're fully active, will go looking for that water, and that's when they'll block drains. So that if you've got drains, drain maintenance is absolutely key. If the drains are blocked or they're not maintained, that's when you're going to get problems with tree roots. Does that make sense? Yeah, to some extent. Well, it's difficult to know whether they're free running. That's the trouble, because you can't crawl up them. but tree drain maintenance is massively important. But don't, if you've got tile drains, don't go planting willow or alder as an example. Unless there's immediate questions, I've got a few slides just on my own farm, just to share, just to show you what we did, albeit it's going to be very different to what a lot of you are farming, but you know, it's a sort of general interest thing, really. So, where are we? I farm there, and you're about there somewhere, yeah.
A bit further up,
there,
northeast of Carlisle.
Yeah,
but yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Just there. Yeah. So a little bit different. We're not that far apart. As Pete will well know, you know, I'm actually a first-generation farmer. I started with nothing, and I got most of it left. And that's what we started with at the beginning of our tenancy back in 1998 when we started here. Quite a different landscape to perhaps what you're used to up in Carlisle. That's a view from above. My house is just here, and it's a pretty flat, open environment. If you'd gone back to the 16th century, this would have been underwater with quite a lot of trees in it. Our local town, as you can see from there, is, where are we? Oh, it's Peterborough. And when Oliver Cromwell decided to have a bit of a fight with the king in the Civil War, the fast setting of the cannon to protect the cathedral in Peterborough was just out of the shot to the south down here. And that's where we're right on the edge of the sort of the wet, boggy area, and our local conurbation or local village is called Farset, and that comes from the setting of the cannons. So that's where it sort of got its name from. And this boundary here, along the left, is an old Neolithic boundary which links a river crossing and a fort just to the south of us. So when we took the farm on, it had basically grown wheat, oilseed rape, barley, and the odd crop of potatoes for maybe 30 years. And we wanted to change into a sort of more multifunctional land use, diversify the sort of cropping enterprises, improve soil and conservation protection, create habitats, and open up new markets. And as someone that trained in soils, the thing that frightened the life out of me was literally watching some of these sort of dust bowl conditions, fen blows, watching the really good quality soil just blow away. And I found that completely unacceptable. I wanted to do something about it. And that's what led me to agroforestry. I was actually thinking about ways to make money, protect soils, enhance the environment, and it led me to some work I've been doing in Uganda on agroforestry, and thinking might I be able to apply those principles to a UK context. But our limitations here were at the time a 15-year farm business tenancy, the need to retain common agricultural policy eligibility, having not a lot of money in my pockets, needing it to be profitable, having no livestock facilities on the farm. In fact, our tenancy specifically prohibits the keeping of livestock. It's a bit bonkers. It's the need of the agents to be able to relet the farm as a cropping farm. So back in 2009, we planted an agroforestry system based on 85 trees per hectare. Now that number is quite important because for two reasons. One, if you remember what I said earlier, is that until 2012, if you planted more than 50 trees per hectare, land ceased to be agricultural. But in 2012, we got that to 100 trees per hectare, changed it under the CAP. So by planting 85 trees per hectare, we were actually eligible for the CAP, no loss of CAP. So here, as you can see, we've got trees, single line of trees, 3 meters between each tree, and they're planted into a 3 meter wide strip, which has got grasses, wildflowers, pollinator, legumes, etc. planted in there. So a 3 meter strip, a 24 meter strip to run machinery up and down and either cut forage or grow a crop, and 3 meters between each tree in the row. That gave us actually 85 trees per hectare over the entire landscape. But when we just look at these sort of strips here with the trees in, we're actually at 1,100 trees per hectare. Unlike an orchard, where there's lots of sort of areas between, we actually grow a crop in between these tree strips on these 24 meter spacings. So everything's got something productive in it all the time. Our fields aren't exactly square. We're subject to internal drainage board regulations, so we can't put structures, fences against the drainage ditches. So we actually leave 24 meters at either end for turning machinery. And then in 2009, we went about planting the trees. And we chose to plant, in our situation, fruit trees. And the reason behind planting fruit trees was on a number of different factors. One, because we could see a resurgence of sort of native English apples for sale and a market opportunity. Secondly, we needed an economic return within the 15 years of that tenancy, and fruit would give us that. I didn't have the luxury of waiting 30 or 40 years for a hardwood. Also we wanted trees that weren't too big in terms of things like shading and size. So we went for fruit trees, and we planted 4,500 trees at that density of 13 different varieties. We got the kids involved in the local schools, part of the curriculum to sort of measure things. My secret hope was when they all became teenagers, they might come back and do some picking, but maybe I was a bit misguided there. There's not very good internet connection out in the middle of those fields, so they can't use their smartphones. We still use field scale machinery. That was important. We've actually adopted a lot of technology, so it's actually led us to a controlled traffic farming system. So everything we grow with now, 6 meter cultivator, 6 meter drill, 6 meter combine. We're using robo crop precision hose in between our cereals. Farms managed organically, so we're not using herbicides, but we use a robo crop system for weed control, which is pretty effective. All the trees were planted with sort of pollen nectar species underneath, wildflowers for beneficial insects, and that's worked really well. The odd bit of micronutrient being put on, first time you put a 24 meter sprayer down a row, you sort of cross your fingers and hope everything's straight, but thankfully it worked. And just a few pictures of sort of what it looks like now. It's a pretty different landscape. The trees have grown, the pollinating species have grown quite a lot. When we get through to later in the season, the trees have got leaf on, the crops have got leaf on, they're all growing. When we get to harvest, the crops are being harvested, but the trees are still putting on growth, putting on fruit. That's sort of what it looks like from above as an alley cropping system. And we harvest the first crop and then go back in and harvest the fruit. Splash of milk, knob of butter, apple pie all in one field. What's not to like? So then we harvest the fruit. We've got two products. This year was a pretty rubbish cereal yield for want of a better reason. Wet winter, dry spring, but actually we had a pretty good fruit year. So we're trying to mitigate risk by having more than one crop type. We're using GPS technology and controlled traffic farming systems for companion planting underneath the crops. But those of you interested in numbers, those are the sort of gross margins we're getting on our oats and on our wheat and on our fruit. Those are sort of wholesale values straight into the market. The beauty for me is that with the fruit, I can take that and stick it on a shelf and sell it, or in a bottle, and I can treble its value, which is pretty difficult to do if you're just a commodity seller. We're trying to add value all the time. And what we did back in 2017, we took a grain store, top left, in the yard where we live, did some investment, and turned that into a farm shop, which has been a bumpy ride, but actually it was the right thing to do, and we're getting increasing footfall. Probably COVID has probably helped us a bit with people wanting local food and local produce. So we put a proportion of our produce through the farm shop itself, both in terms of veg and in terms of juice and fruit. And then we process all our fruit now into bottles, about 5,000 bottles of fruit juice, and sell it all through the shop and add some value that way. So some concluding sort of thoughts on agroforestry. Really, it's about, I think as agroforestry is sort of ecological intensification rather than sustainable intensification. It's trying to use what is already there better in terms of space, nutrients and water, trying to improve resource capture. From what I've seen of agroforestry systems throughout the UK and elsewhere in the world, profitability is generally equal to or greater than a monocultural system. We're trying to get that sort of soil and environmental protection, improving biodiversity, trying to maintain the annual income from animals, but have a long-term income from the tree elements. Policy is catching up. It's coming, it's coming down the line pretty quick, and I think Committee on Climate Change, it's one of their top 5 things, agroforestry for climate change mitigation. Government are certainly getting behind it now. When you think about the built environment, we move from sort of single-story dwellings to, I don't know what those idiots in the middle one do, but multi-story dwellings in Downing Street to high-rise buildings, and it's about using space better. Agroforestry, I think, can be a sort of climate-smart breakthrough for agriculture, both from a cropping and from a silvopastoral perspective. It doesn't have to be the whole farm. Just 20% of the farm could make a big difference. 5.8% of land with tree cover would meet our climate change zero net carbon emissions. I use that 5.8% figure. We're 8% here on our own farm, so we're nearly double that figure just from what we've done. So it's quite achievable. And trees will grow in most places, and agroforestry is one of those few things that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, help protect natural resources, and give more productivity. They don't need more input to get more output. We're getting more input from sunlight. So when you go out in the morning and you step out the door of the farmhouse, just sort of look down at your feet and look up at the sky and think about the space that we're not using that perhaps we could use, perhaps in a slightly different, more imaginative way by integrating trees in the system. And remember that that overused comment of the most dangerous phrase in our language is, well, we've always done it this way. Perhaps there are different ways to think about doing things, and that sometimes the thing that's holding us back most perhaps is all in our own mind. We just need to think about things in a different way. So I hope that's been an interesting sort of discussion to get you thinking about how trees can play an integral part of farming systems.
That's been absolutely fascinating, Steve. I mean, you've certainly given us a whole comprehensive overview about that, and it certainly answered a lot of questions and queries what I had. I mean, one of them being with agroforestry in a livestock setting, with the shelter for the cattle and the livestock, and the livestock congregating there and causing compaction issues, and would that affect the tree growth, but with the root trimming, with the subsoiler going up and down. Well, it's sort of like answered that question, really.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. We need to think as much about what's going on above ground as you do what's going on below ground. And actually, we manage canopies, and we manage grass by cutting it and grazing it. We don't think about what we're doing to grass below ground, and it's just as important, because there's an equal amount of plant above ground as below ground.
Has anybody else got any questions for Stephen?
If I can jump in, please. It was very interesting, Stephen. Thank you very much for all of that.
Pleasure.
Just a little information on where we farm. We're up in the north of the area, and we're already 47% forested with mainly Sitka spruce, and at a point of almost saturation with them, really. Interesting what you've said, though, all the same. We're a patchwork of small, old family fields, really. Farm fields, which goes back to quite possibly many hundreds of years. You've talked about agroforestry, but what about enriched hedgerows?
Yeah, I mean,
these are small fields already.
So I've talked about trees in the round, but actually, England is already an agroforestry landscape, and hedges are an integral part of our farming systems, but we generally recognise them for biodiversity and for wildlife. We don't really add them to our bottom line. And I think the easiest place to start with agroforestry sort of thinking is about how we manage our hedges, and what hedges can offer the bottom line, rather than just being flailed and cut and left for nature. Yes, they have natural benefits for biodiversity, but there's certainly benefits in terms of browse for livestock, for shelter. The difference between a hedge and a hedgerow is a hedgerow's got trees in it, a hedge doesn't. Can we plant trees within hedges and increase their value? There are opportunities. I know some French farmers who have some really whizzy equipment, and they harvest their hedges. They don't just flail them, they harvest and hoover up the chippings and turn it into biomass. And that biomass is dried and then sold as wood chip. So there's it's a different conversation, because they're getting an economic return from it. Add in there the potential for carbon, and it gets really exciting.
Has anybody done the calculations for carbon sequestration in hedgerows and to the true value of them?
Yeah, well, probably not as well as they should have done, but there has been some work done by the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology at CEH, I think at Bangor. But there is a recognition that hedges are an important part, both from a carbon perspective, but also from a landscape and from a biodiversity perspective. So the easy place to start for everything we've talked about is look at don't go and plant a load of new trees. Look at what you've already got, and that's hedges. To my mind, Sitka spruce, it's just another monoculture.
Yeah.
It's just, yes, we need timber, but I think there are other ways of getting timber.
I think it's still upside timber.
And are there opportunities to do woodland grazing? We all spend a lot of money putting a shed up for animals to live in over the winter. Well, nature provides a shed. It's got a timber timber upright and a green roof. So perhaps there's opportunities for some woodland grazing in certain places in the right context. And that's where's he gone? One of the other chaps that was on the call, Chris. You saw what Andrew Barber was doing up in Scotland at Blair Athol, very much using trees as part of the sort of nighttime shelter for animals, for sheep in particular.
Yeah, it was interesting actually, because Andrew had planted trees initially just to provide shelter belts. We all understand what, farmers planted hedges hundreds of years ago because it kept stock in, so they were living fences, but they also provided shelter. And actually, Cumbria hasn't lost its hedgerows in quite the same way as the arable East has, because farmers still value hedges as shelter. But I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, Stephen, about what we need to think about. This is all about the economics. How does this impact on the bottom line? So if we think about Andrew Barber he's farming at 1,000 feet with cattle and sheep, so not dissimilar to in many ways to what you guys are doing in Bewcastle. But he said, well, I can't afford the investment to have these animals calving indoors. I can't afford to buy a lot of straw, a lot of faffing about with calving and lambing indoors. I need the trees as the shelter. And the cows are perfectly happy calving outdoors, providing he's got enough shelter for them. And so that was his sort of motivation. It was a financial motivation and also a welfare motivation, because the last thing you want is a lot of stock in sheds getting pneumonia. That there is sometimes that benefit of fresh air. Now, obviously, there are limitations around that, around soil, but actually, in a way, your trees are kind of providing some of the answers to soil health as well. So it's about trying to find that right happy medium. So, Stephen, I've got a question while I'm gabbling away here. I'm interested really in the forage, the palatability of browsing leaves for livestock. Now, I did find some Dutch research for dairy cows browsing willow on alder. But I was just wondering if you had some pointers, or you could send us some pointers of, I want to look at, you put some really good figures up there about fat, protein and sugar content of some of those leaves. And I suppose I want to sort of compare that in terms of the productivity of, we could argue that actually, have we got the right species in the hedge, or have we got the right balance of species? If we want to start with hedges, should we actually be putting some of these willows and alders and things in? Have we got the right, because the species that we find in our hedgerows, we have a lot of quickthorn, but obviously that was to turn stock back, but we now seem to rely on sheep netting fences to keep stock back rather than the hedge themselves. So is the function of the hedge, apart from providing berries for birds in the winter, it sort of shocks me that if we're going to start valuing carbon, when we come to fell a hedge, we chop it all down, we push it all up into a heap and burn it, the horizons. And I'm thinking, actually, should we not be turning that into money rather than watching that money go up in smoke? There's a whole set of questions. So one was, where can we go and get a bit more data about the palatability, the feed value in hedges, not just hedges, but obviously in trees generally, because I wanted to convert that back into the bottom line.
So the good resource, there are two good resources there on the palatability and nutritional content. One of the slides I put up was from a lady called Lindsay Wistance, and Lindsay did some work that was part Reading University and part Organic Research Centre. So that's a good place to start. She actually did a really good set of presentations at the Oxford Real Farming Conference, I think 2 years ago. That would have been 2018. So they're available, as a sort of back catalogue online on a repository there on the Oxford Real Farming Conference. So you should be able to find information there. The other person is guy called Ted Green. And if any of you have ever met Ted Green,
yeah.
Ted can talk underwater, can Ted. You'll find him, there's something called the Farm Woodland Forum, of which Paul Burgess from Cranfield University is the moderator and the chair. Peter will know him from days of old. Yeah. That's a really good repository for that information as well. So, you know, if you sent something through to the Farm Woodland Forum, that they would be able to connect you. Ted was on there today, funnily enough, talking about certain species, but they'll be able to connect you with him. And he's probably the UK lead of information on tree hay. So the data I showed you was on fresh leaves. If you have, just as you cut grass and turn it into hay, you increase the nutritional value by taking the water out, higher dry matter. Exactly the same is true of trees, and those leaves which have dried have a much higher nutritional content. So animals will eat them dry as well as fresh. In context of the other stuff, hedge is really important. You know, I was told anecdotally that the reason we all have blackthorn and whitethorn in our hedges is it was a really good marketing job by some Edwardian nursery people. They did a job on us. That's about the only way you can explain it, because the nutritional benefit, okay, they have some stock-proof benefits, but there's a whole range of other species, whether that's aspen or willow or dogwood or you know, whatever. There are that diversity is really quite important.
Cool.
I mean, it's interesting you're saying about the foliage. I mean, I remember going to Latvia years ago, about late 90s, and because they've got very few natural resources there, you know, tree foliage was a few things they had, and they processed them and using a chlorophyll paste as a concentrate for livestock feed, and they were getting the essential oils from the leaves for all sorts of cosmetics and things. So they really, you know, utilize them on a huge scale.
I was very fortunate to spend quite a bit of time in China a few years ago, and if you want to go and see agroforestry at scale, go to China.
Yeah.
I mean, in Henan province alone, which is sort of in the middle belt on the Yellow River, there's I think there's 3.2 million hectares of agroforestry, and given that we're only sort of 7 million hectares of agriculture in the whole of the UK, it's pretty scalable. And the tree of choice there is Paulownia.
Okay.
It's a nitrogen fixing tree. It has quite an open canopy, and 40 to 60% of the tree canopy is harvested every year to feed animals. Very high protein content because it's a nitrogen fixer.
Okay.
And also that they can't divert land to livestock production. Land is for human consumption of food. You know, animals are kept off land largely in buildings, and forage is carried to them, and trees are a really important part of that dietary provision.
Okay.
So, yeah, same way.
Has anybody else got any questions for Steve?
I suppose I'm just going to sort of come back with a bit of a take-home comment that for me, that I'm thinking that my take-home messages from tonight are stack or layer your enterprises, because what you've done, Stephen, is actually you've diversified your farm production system, And in a year like this, where cereal prices and yields have been low, you know, you've not had all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. And I think maybe that is a message that I'm thinking, actually, you know, British agricultural policy has really pushed farmers through economics to specialise in single operations. So, you know, you're either all dairy or you're all sheep, or you're the days of mixed farming. We still have some mixed farms in Cumbria, but you know, actually, what you're trying to do is mixed farming, and it's that stacking of enterprises that are working in connection with each other, sort of a symbiotic relationship of enterprises. So I suppose, and it's that the other way of looking at it is farming vertically as well as horizontally. I think that's quite, for me, those are sort of kind of the messages that I'll take away from today.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, the driver for the diversity was risk.
Yeah.
You know, farming. Someone once said to me, "What do you do for a living?" I said, "I'm a professional gambler, aka a farmer." You know, you chuck your investment into the roulette wheel once a year, and you know, depending on what God throws at us in terms of the weather and the markets, most of which are out of our control, you may or may not get a decent return. It is professional gambling. So what we've always tried to minimise risk by having a range of different enterprises that can deal with the climate shocks and the market shocks and the weather shocks that are thrown at us. And yeah, 3-dimensional farming.
And now policy shocks as well. So yeah.
Yeah, and COVID shocks and everything else. Yeah.
Stephen, if I can pipe in, it's more of a comment really, to reiterate your 3-dimensional farming. I'm involved quite closely now with DEFRA, RPA and a bunch of others trying to forward the whole grants for agroforestry, you know, in the coming sort of elms. And I've coined the phrase without hearing it from yourself, 3D grant aid, because the RPA think very 2-dimensionally. And it's going down quite well so far. We'll see what comes out the other end, but they're definitely listening, and I'm encouraged that they want to try and accommodate this. And the agri-climate team in DEFRA are absolutely hell-bent on making this work. So I'm really quite confident that we'll end up with something usable at the end of it. It might take some time, but I think agroforestry is definitely on the map now, here to stay.
As a passing comment, thank you, Jen. That's really, really good to hear. One of the things I've been trying to get our policy makers and DEFRA to think about is not only multifunctional land use, but also multi-operator land use. Because there's an assumption that all farmers have got all the skills and all the interests and all the investment that they'll ever need. But what I've been trying to get people to think about is perhaps if you do want trees on the farm, perhaps it's a partnership with somebody else that plants and manages the trees for you, which you get an equi benefit from, a joint benefit from. Might be a sensible way to start. So, you know, the gentleman at the top there said about hedges, but maybe someone else is managing the hedges on the farm and getting an income from them, and you're getting some of the shelter and biodiversity benefits and economic benefits. We don't necessarily need to do everything ourselves.
Totally agree, and we have some moves afoot in the forestry world on that front as well, but that's yet to come.
Good.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
I was very. Can I just say something? I was very interested to hear Jim's take on all that. For the last 2 years, RPA has been trying to take £1,500 a year of my single farm payment because of encroachment of canopy from SSI land. They don't seem to get the idea that it's actually the other side of the fence and it's canopy, and the fact that they've took all the grazed woodland off me single farm payment because they say that the tree cover is too dense or whatever to do it. It is quite interesting.
I think
maybe a new policy.
Yeah, the RPA have clearly been quite zealous in those areas. I think that is going to change. I think there's going to be very much a liberalisation there. So,
and on the other point about grazed woodland, this farm here, I'm a tenant on it, and up to about 30 years ago, all the cattle were wintered out in the wood edges that are probably 50, 60 acre of oak woodland along here, and it was only with the triple SI on there that sheds were put up and those cattle were fetched inside, and the whole nature of the farm was changed. And it's all down to policies, short-termist policies that's taken all this away. On your fact of your 24 meters of your strips, your arable strips between your woodland, most of the farms up here aren't much bigger. The fields aren't much bigger than that, with tree boundaries along it. And a lot of the farmland up here is of a nature of almost like a regenerative sort of agriculture, with one crop of silage a year. The carbon capture up here will be immense, but the figures have never been put together. You're looking at why the carbon is only in the top few inches of a lot of these arable soils, and that simply because on a lot of the dairy farms that the grass isn't allowed to grow to an adequate length to allow the roots to put the carbon in the ground. A lot of the successful farmers up here run a regenerative type of agriculture, moving stock around when there's adequate cover of grass so that the carbon's captured. A consequence of good farming husbandry. The one thing that does make us different up here is 8 inches of rain in July.
That's right. Yeah.
That's where we are totally different.
Interesting point there, Colin, you made about grass. The graph I showed right at the beginning showing a decrease in soil organic carbon, even in permanent improved grassland. Yeah. That's a consequence of actually a switch from sort of multi-species pastures with deep roots.
Yeah.
And the advent
intensive grazing as well, and multi-cuts of grass, where you're saying that your carbon no longer gets put down once your arable cut comes off, your crop comes off. It's just the same in a grassland scenario where you're taking 4 and 5 cuts of grass a year. That carbon isn't going to be put down the roots because the roots have reached no length. I was talking to Chris about this, on his own farm, where they were saying, the soil is so compact and a layer of almost like sludge on the top because it's not going down any depth, just because of dairy farming techniques and all the rest of it, trying to produce a leafy, high protein.
But also the switch to perennial ryegrass in the sort of 60s, 70s, and the greater use of bag N, because ryegrass, when Hurley Research Institute down in the south and Bangor did all the research on ryegrasses, they found, on herbage mixtures, they found that the most responsive thing to bag nitrogen was perennial ryegrass.
Yeah.
But the consequence of that is it's all really shallow rooting.
It doesn't need to go searching for the nutrient.
No, that's right. But the consequence has been, which is why we've lost carbon in permanent pasture, is that the roots are all at the surface.
Yeah.
There's no resilience there. There's no drainage. There's compaction, etc. So having deeper rooting species, just as you said, thinking about 3-dimensional farming, whether that's grasses or trees or shrubs or hedges, is really important to get those roots down there.
The other thing I was quite interested in was, grazing cattle, ruminants, eating trees and leaves and all the rest of it. I've noticed mine in the last fortnight, loads of grass in the field, and they're going around looking for these things because the grass has reached that level now at this time of year. It's just what we call wind and water. There's nothing in there. And the stuff's going straight through them, and there's no scratch. The scratch that they need to be able to process that protein. The protein will still be there, but the fact that there's no scratch with it, and that's what they're looking for when they're eating that sort of stuff, just to be able to digest through the rumens. And
so the most important thing to take away from today, perhaps, is follow your livestock round.
Yeah, see what they're doing.
Watch what they're eating.
Yeah.
Record what they're eating at different times of year, what they're browsing, and then ask your question, okay, so if they're selecting those particular species, what do I need to provide them?
And I guess as that then combines with looking at the data, on the palatability, because and also if you're looking at whether it's sugars, whether it's fats and proteins, and different species of tree will provide different levels of that at different times in the year, presumably. So you might sort of say, well, actually, weirdly, the sheep will go and marmalise willow in May, but at other times of the year they might not touch it as much, and then they'll turn their attention to a different species. So I just wonder if there's a whole kind of knowledge base that we need to rebuild on understanding when and why stock browse particular things and what's in it for them. Because once we can measure what's in it for them, we can provide that and build that into our forage rations, and we'll value our hedges as more than just simply, historic items in the landscape.
Almost certainly what they're taking at spring will be to help balance the mineral balance, because the grass is growing so quickly, short of magnesium, short of selenium, short of cobalt. That's why they're grazing on these tougher sort of plants at the spring alongside that, and probably why they don't really bother as much during the summer when the grass is getting coarser and stronger by the day. And then by the time the flush comes at the autumn with the regrowths, they start hunting again to try and balance things up.
Yep. I think that would be, from my point of view, that would be a really good sort of almost follow-on talk. Really, is to look more at that nutrition side. The data that I've looked at has come up with stuff particularly around selenium and calcium, but it's looking at all of those nutrients as well as the fats, the sugars, the proteins, and building up a ration. We've put a huge amount of research into how to cut grass at the optimum day to maximise the sugars in the silage pit, but we never looked at the blooming trees that the animals are chasing around and ratcheting through the hedge for. Have we just not missed a massive trick?
Well, it's very simple. The reason behind that is there's nobody rocking up in a BMW at the farm gate selling your trees.